The only Jesus I know is him, and the one thing he don't need is a partner.
Mama, how do we know Jesus wasn't black? He could have been from the lost tribe of Israel. They were supposed to be black.
I bet they were. If ever people were lost, we're it.
Jesus was black, the Bible would have said so.
But it does say so.
What are you talking about?
I read about it. It's in Revelations chapter 1, verse 14. I read about it in Muhammad Speaks. It says, his hair is like wool, and his eyes are like flame of fire.
Well, Lord have mercy. It sure do say that, don't it?
Okay, I was just thinking about this morning. I grew up Baptist. I went to Vacation Bible School. I've read the Bible. I don't know if I'm interpreting it correctly, but if we are made in God's image, right, and the first modern humans originated in Africa, if God has a human form, God is black. God is black.
I was a Christian missionary for years, but there came a time in my life when I realized that what I was taught about the Bible was a lie. In my confusion, I cried out for help. I met an Israelite who introduced me to the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, who is described in the Bible as having hair white as wool and eyes red as fire. Yes, the God in the Bible is black.
There were black Jews in Africa, in Egypt, or the Sudan, before there were ever any other kind of Jews there. Because what defines a Jew was, to some degree, not to all degree, stolen from the Egyptians. That is to say, a supreme god, circumcision, all that kind of stuff. The Egyptians were doing that. Now, there were black Egyptians who were doing it before the biblical Hebrews picked that up during the Exodus when they were in Egypt.
So who are the real Jews? And there's really two answers to that question. It's going to upset a lot of people. Well, the Fehalim, which is a term for the so-called Palestinians, the migrant farmers that never left the land of Israel in 70 of the Common Era when the Romans came in. They still were attached to the land. They were called the Fehalim, or what we call today the so-called Palestinians, are in fact the descendants of the poor agricultural Jewish society that stayed in the land, yet they converted to Islam in the 6th and 7th centuries to avoid paying the Islamic jizya tax, because if they had done that, they would have lost their land, and they were attached to the land, so therefore they converted to Islam so that they could stay in the land, working the soil that their forefathers worked. This is recognized in 1918 by the historians David Ben-Gurion, who of course was the future Prime Minister of Israel back then, and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the future President of Israel. Both of them historians recognize this fact. Today, of course, it's buried in your history book.
Before they said Jesus was born in a manger in Bethlehem, they said he was born in a cave in Ethiopia. It was at the Nicene Conference that changed that. Let's go further.
Wait a minute, let me be sure I'm following you now. You're saying that the birth of Christ as we know it is not accurate.
It's a farce. It was only...
You realize what you're saying?
A farce, a lie. You know what a lie is?
A lie is a lie.
The person who wrote that at the Nicene Conference of Bishops in 325 AD, Constantine, the Roman emperor, ordered a conference be held because Rome wanted to take over Christianity from the people who started it. Christianity was started with Pantheus and Boetius in a place called Alexandria in Egypt. And Egypt is in Africa. I saw it up to January the 9th, it was there.
You're one of Canada's preeminent religious scholars and spent virtually the entire adult life analyzing, teaching, writing about the biblical scriptures.
The Gospels whose dating is not quite as precise as people would lead us to believe, and only really come together fully about 150 Common Era. But their origins, the tradition is believed to have come out of the 1st century. I'm interested in evidence. If it's going to be history, let's have evidence. The funny thing was, Alan, the farther the church got away from the supposed time of Jesus' life, the more sure it became of what went on. The closer it got to that supposed time, the more vague it became. That's the very reverse of what happens with any truly historical person.
I want to get into evidence, but first you've called your book The Pagan Christ. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is partially to still continue the answer to your original question. At this point, about 3 years ago, was sent by a chap whom I didn't know, but who was a United Church clergyman, some material. He said, I think you should look at this material. And when I started to read it, I realized I was looking at a payload of fact, of evidence that I'd never seen in my life before. And as I examined this, at first I thought it can't be, and as I went on, I realized cumulatively it was. And it was proof that prior to the 3rd or 4th centuries, Christianity had been very different from the way it was after Constantine, the Council of Nicaea, and the 4th century. That a big change had taken place. And that's what struck me. When I saw that had happened, and the way in which they were prepared to kill, to burn books, to destroy the evidence of it having happened, that I realized something untoward was really at work here.
Well, let's give our viewers some sense of the similarities, because you go through this evidence and you say, well, here's the New Testament. I mean, that virtually everything that Jesus was reported to have done in the Gospels, from the Sermon on the Mount to the crucifixion, was told in ancient Egyptian religious writing. Give us some examples there of the same kind of stories that were being told 4 or 5 centuries earlier.
Oh, more than that, even thousands of years earlier. Yeah, this was my astonishment. When I read for the first time, Alan, a story that I used to be a professor of New Testament, a story that had always been problematic for me, the raising of Lazarus, which is in the 4th Gospel, and it's the most dramatic miracle that Jesus is supposed to have carried out. He raised a man from the dead who had been dead 4 days. He was really dead. When I came across that story, in all its full details, in an Egyptian dress and in an Egyptian setting, right down to Martha and Mary and to the coming forth out of the tomb, in every detail, in 1700, before the Common Era, 17 centuries earlier, I realized I was onto shadow.
In 1707, there was a scholar at Oxford named John Mill, unrelated to John Stuart Mill, the Victorian that some of you know about. This John Mill was a textual scholar of the New Testament. He spent 30 years of his life studying the manuscripts of the New Testament. He had access to about 100 manuscripts of the New Testament, and he studied them thoroughly, and then he put together a book. He called it the Novum Testamentum Graeci, the Greek New Testament of John Mill in 1707. And what he did in this Greek New Testament is he printed a line or two of the Greek verses from the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, verse 2, verse 3. But then at the bottom of the page, he listed places where the manuscripts had differences for every verse. To the shock and dismay of his readers, John Mill's Greek New Testament listed 30,000 places where the manuscripts disagreed with one another. 30,000 places of variation among the manuscripts. Now, some of his detractors were quite upset by this and claimed that John Mill had published his Novum Testamentum Graeci in order to render the text of the New Testament uncertain. They thought this was some kind of demonic plot on the part of a university professor. But his supporters pointed out he hadn't actually invented these 30,000 places of variation. He just noticed that they exist, as they do exist in our manuscripts.
Why does it matter that Jesus was a black African, you ask? Well, here's why. Jesus has been presented to the world as a white man for approximately 2,000 years, although he was black. The white Jesus is problematic because if God's divine Son is white, the brain computer then says that his father must be white. Consequently, black people may struggle to challenge what white people have taught them or have said to them because unconsciously, they feel like challenging a white person is like challenging God. Thus, white males can control the minds of black people and all the people of color across the globe with the image of the white Jesus. The white Jesus is a tool of European colonialism and psychological warfare being used against people of color, and black people especially, through the use of this image. Many, although not all, white men practice or endorse racism, white supremacy, which is a legally and institutionally backed system that aims to maltreat people of color, and black people especially, for the purposes of the white collective's fun, glory, material gain, and white genetic survival. Thus, unconsciously, when a black person thinks that God, insert white male, is telling them to do something, it very well might be that what they will do is in the interest of white male supremacists, as opposed to themselves. The white supremacists must have thought, hey, if I can make my voice the voice of God, I can hold a great deal of power over people, especially people of color. Europe colonized the majority of the globe, and while dead Christianity as a handmaiden of European conquest, the minds of black people have been colonized, and the decolonizing process has to take place in religion. For example, corporal punishment, e.g., hitting children with belts, is a legacy of slavery and European colonialism, as there's no evidence that this practice was used in pre-colonial West Africa. In her book titled, Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America, Dr. Stacey Patton states, quote, "Whooping children didn't begin as a black thing. It's not even native to blacks. There's no evidence that black people's ancestors in West Africa embraced this kind of child rearing. It was introduced with the arrival of Europeans on the African continent centuries ago. Blacks have just kept the tradition going," end quote. Many black people still endorse this practice because of what they learned from white supremacists during colonization and enslavement, and then link it back to the Bible they were told was inerrant. However, as Proverbs 3 verse 31 says, quote, "Envy thou not the oppressor, and choose none of his ways," end quote. Many aspects of the Bible ought to be used as tools for liberating the black mind, as opposed to shackling it, and by holding the historical Jesus in one's mind, who was indeed a black man, it will assist in the decolonizing process.